But I would like to show you a small video and talk across that, also because it juxtapositions with what's been said and takes another point of departure. And then some principles which I think would be interesting to touch on this, also because it bridges between, I think, what Monica has been presenting and what may come later with Magdalena's presentation and so on. I'm sure Ari will also take up many of the same references as Monica had in her speech. So that's really quite lucky, actually. But let's look at this short video. Now I'm going to speak across this video. You must be able to hear it though, because it's quite a fun soundscape. Station House Opera is a British company, and they have created this site-specific piece with 7,000 building blocks of the cheap kind, which are set up on the periphery of the city, and they travel towards the city. You can see in the background. This was done over a few days, filming, and the last part you're going to see is actually live in the city as an event. When we talk about territories and we talk about how artists make interventions and connect with the city, of course, it is done in very, very different ways. And this little trip through the suburbs and the everyday are in sharp contrast with both a playful, we all remember these dominoes from our childhood, but also a very avant-gardist kind of intervention. And as we know, art does challenge our normality, and we can see a good example of that in this work. The longer version of this has been downloaded 5 million times, which is interesting because it kind of shows that people are really find it intriguing about how this thing of normality doesn't need a lot to change it. And also the act of reclaiming the public space as an artistic space or cultural space is symbolized here, of course. And you will soon see the crowd standing for the live event. And the blocks are set up at night. So 7,000 blocks are set up at night. And people see these blocks on the way to work in the morning, or to school, or to the shops, or to the office. And they have to decide if they want to drive through them, or lift the bike over, or leave them alone. And the wonderful thing is they are all left alone. So it's also about trust. And again, it says, so here we have about 20,000 people. It's like a kind of architectural Tour de France, where the blocks are falling, as the bikers also do, and making these kind of narratives through the city, and going into public spaces, private spaces, and playing with the notion of power, because this is the law courts, there's also the cathedral, there are also the National Museum, and this invading the everyday, these blocks are everyday building blocks, invading the royal, invading the privacy, the privilege of the society. So this, of course, is the notion of that art is challenging these preconceived notions, preconceived spaces, and connecting and making people not only enjoy the city, but also play with it. The factor of play, being allowed to play, being illogical, not going in straight lines, being childish, you might say, and being able to touch and sense the city in another way is one of the important things of working with the arts in an urban context. And this also means that you have to get permission, of course, to do this. And the act of engaging the owners, the protectors of these spaces to do something like this and block the traffic at rush hour for 20 minutes and about 10,000 cars calling the police and others to find out what's going on is, of course, about trying to make people aware of the quality of the city, the quality of the space, but also protesting. So this is this silent balance which art often has to be positive and negative and to point at what is there and what is not there. And here we're going into the town hall. I hope your video is not as kind of shaky as mine. It seems to be quite shaky, which is a shame. I'm not quite sure what the cause of that is. And at the end, and then I think as soon as we finish, we'll go. There are lots of people hanging around to see this strange kind of art piece meet the end, and it's quite dystopic. So this kind of dystopian fall of civilization, which kind of unfolds between us. This could be very Athenian in its construction, actually. If you're looking at the blocks and the white. It would be white marble here, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be these breeze blocks. It would be something far more royal, far more important. Okay, let's cut off there. And then maybe go to PowerPoint. So that's an example, in a way, as a kind of symbolic example of how a cultural perspective and a cultural trajectory and the city meet. If you're looking at this in a more analytical way and saying about how do we look at the urban environment and how do we plan and control it, I set up this little diagram here which shows two kind of axes. We have on the bottom left from controlled and planned to interventionist and participatory. And then we have on the bottom infrastructure-led, which is, and then the cultural and human-led. And then if we look at where traditional planning is focused, it's traditionally in this area. But as Monica already said, this is already changing rapidly, and I think we all are aware of this. So if we go on, these are just examples of other kind of playful events which are questioning our concept of urbanism and the city. Next one. And we're seeing that something else is being developed in the other side of the graph. And this is going from traditional planning to something which might call cultural planning. Cultural planning, which is an umbrella term, it's been used for a number of years, but it actually is not so much about planning anymore. It is more about acting out, engaging. And this has given rise to a huge number of, you might say, styles or approaches to people who are involved in either the urbanism or social context or in artistic concepts. So all the kind of terms you can read here are under this umbrella of a cultural perspective of the city. Durational performances, creative user, do-it-yourself urbanism, temporary use, urban gaming, urban gardening, and so on. And this is the last 20 years, this huge number of initiatives under this umbrella, not planned and not coordinated, but they are actually generated by people themselves. Yes, next. And we roll on. And then some of the characteristics of these are, we're looking from the long term to the here and now. Do we believe in the long term? Can we plan for the long term? From the large scale to the small scale, it is the 1-to-1, which is really important, and not the 1,000-to-1. From the public sector to the public collective. And then from finance driven to resources. I mean, most of these things are very, very small scale, and we find the resources, we don't have the finance. And maybe it's not who owns them or ownership, it's about loanership. And very important is from the permanent to the temporary. I remember the heading in the New York Times 4 years ago in the Venice Biennale was, "The temporary is the only permanent thing we have," was splashed across the front page. And from planning, the idea that we can actually plan is time and time again being eradicated and challenged, and we have to adapt. And then from what we call the organizational, to organize things, we have to talk about relations. The relational is more important. And from the rational idea of the city to the emotional and sensorial of the city or of the society. And from the theoretical to the hands-on. So these are some of the characteristics of these things I've been just presenting. And if we go to the next one. And then the notion of building the city to the notion of creating the city, as Charles Landry would say. And from the concrete city to the urban landscape. We no longer believe in the city as 1 or 2 or 3 dimensional. It is completely layered and changing all the time, this sort of metamorphosis situation. And then from the above approach of scaling down, scaling up to the human scale. And from the determinist, thinking we can decide what's going to happen, to actually the interventionist, to actually looking at how maybe you might call it acupuncture, the acupunctural kind of interventionist approach. And from what I would call the architectural to the architectural, trying to encourage architects to become, and revert maybe back to becoming artists, seeing the dichotomy of the architectural approach now. So we are, as also Monica highlighted in a way, she had a slide which was almost like this, from urban planning to participatory urban transformation. And as soon as we're doing this, of course, it suggests that the planning of the city is no longer the issue. It's the evolving of the city where we have rights and we have an input, and we have also, as citizens, responsibilities. So this is also about a change in perspective. Next one, please. And at the center of this, I think I'll shortly, I'll leave it with this one, is the role of the public or the urban space. And as how important it is, most of these strategies and most of what we are looking at today, the urban space plays an increasingly important role. And this is, on the bottom, you might say, with the revival of the street as the political arena of protest and engagement. There was a good example of that yesterday. And Athens is a place where certainly this kind of dynamic is very, very prevalent and very obvious. Whereas it's also the search for new artistic arenas, new publics, new formats outside of the institutions. The institutions are definitely challenged. So where do we need to go to find these other publics and other methods of connecting with the agendas which Monica also suggested? But this is also in the search for new urban strategies, in our reformulation of what are communities and what are neighborhoods in continual urban processes. And often, as Klaus also was talking about, that it's hugely used in attracting tourism and branding for the city, is how the public space is seen, designed, worked on. And then the other aspect, in which I mentioned before, is that it's not just about the urban, it's also about the environmental. So we have lots of social activists and environmentalists who are activating and working in the public space. And then we have finally the factor that locative and social media expand and deconstruct actually the spaces. And this whole old kind of idea of form follows function, which is an architectural kind of term, form follows function, is completely torpedoed, and form follows fiction is the title of the day. And in all these things, it becomes a a very hybrid universe where, of course, culture and urbanism and the social context and the political are all intermeshed. I think there's a lot more to say on that, and the slides will be available. But I think now I'd like to end, and actually we leap into, and I hope Ari is with us for the start of the first theme formally, although I've kind of opened it up, and we all did. All three speakers opened it up in their own way.